Hello, Prof. Anita and my thesis advisor, Bu Susana. I'm sending you again my video of my thesis proposal writing because Bu Susana told me that I have to make another new video for Prof. Anita to see because I want also get feedback from you, Prof. Anita. So yesterday I already met Bu Susana. I already asked her opinion and also feedback, advice, and I have revised my thesis proposal writing. So this is my proposal. And as you can see, Prof. Anita, I changed my title because Bu Susana she told me that better for me to change my title. So my previous title was exploring the challenges and benefits of the use of podcasts in higher education to enhance student speaking skills. Then I changed my title into students' perception in the benefits and challenges of using podcasts in developing English speaking skills. Susana told me that better for me to use this title rather than the previous title. In this video, I only want to show my chapter 1, my introduction to you, Prof. Anita, because I have revised it based on the Bu Susana's advice. She told me about step by step what information I have to explain. So this is my background of study. In the first paragraph, I mentioned a little bit about technology and then I connected it with podcast. So this is my first paragraph. I also mentioned that podcast innovation also grows rapidly, and this is the fact because of the variety of podcasts. There are many of them available. And then the second paragraph, I mentioned and described about what is podcast usually used by people for what. So usually people use it for two purposes. The first one is for entertainment, and the second one is for education. Here, I also mentioned the example of the podcast itself. So the example of entertainment podcast is Scam Here and There. So after that, I also mentioned the host and what they are doing in their podcast. It's also the same with the second example. Here is the example of an education podcast. So the title is Espresso English Podcast. This is the host, and this is what she is doing in her podcast. So she teaches grammar, vocabulary, idioms, and many other lessons. And then the third paragraph here, I described about podcasts can also serve as an educational purposes. Because of that, many schools and universities utilize it. And then I also put the references. In the next paragraph, I mentioned about two different previous studies. Here, the previous studies is about school that have implemented podcasts in classes to enhance student speaking skills. So the first study is this. This is the first study. It's conducted by Bustari. So this is the school, High School 11 of Banda Aceh. And then the second study conducted by Bulan. So this is in 2017, and then this is in the 2018. This is the school SMAN 4 Jember. Yeah. And then the next paragraph, I mentioned about speaking also. So in the first, second, third, and fourth paragraph, I describe a lot about podcasts and what is usually podcast used. And then I also mentioned about podcasts that is implemented in school and universities and references that support this data, that support this information. And then the next one, in the next paragraph, I mentioned about speaking that speaking is difficult, is the most difficult skill to master. There are also some references to support this statement. Yeah, I mean, this one. Speaking remains the most difficult skill to master. And then the next paragraph is to continue the previous paragraph just a little bit. It's the continuation of the previous paragraph. And then Bu Susana advised me to add this information also at the end of my background study. That the researcher, me, I want to see if students find podcasts useful in developing their language proficiency, specifically in speaking. And then I also changed my research questions. Previously, I have 3 research questions, but then I only use 2 because these 2 are the most connected questions to my study that can support my study. So the first research question is, what is the aspect of speaking that gets the most benefits of podcast use? And then the second one, what are the challenges and benefits of listening to a podcast in relation to English learning? So challenges and benefits is really connected with my title. And then the aspect of speaking that gets the most benefits of podcast use here, I will get the answer from questionnaire that I will distribute later on to the participants. And then research objectives and theoretical framework is still the same because they are already correct based on Bu Susana's advice. Yeah, this is just a little bit information of my chapter 2 later on. And then the significance of study is still the same. Definition of key terms, I use only 3: podcast, speaking skills, and also perception. This is my scope and limitation of study. And lastly, this is my organization of the study. Yeah, basically, I want just to show my chapter 1. I want to ask for your feedback, Prof. Anita, whether is it already good enough so that I can move on to my chapter 2. Actually, I have written a little bit in my chapter 2. So the first one I will describe about podcast, and then the second one I will describe about speaking. And then later on in the number 3, I will describe also the previous study related to podcast with speaking skills. So I separated them. First one, podcast, and then the second one, speaking. The third one is previous studies. Yeah. So here I mentioned about podcast and then the types of podcast, the example of podcast. And then speaking, I mentioned about the four aspects in it: grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and fluency. Yeah, that's all from me, Prof. Anita and Bu Susana. I only want to show you my chapter 1, and Bu Susana have already seen my thesis proposal writing before, but she advised me to send the video again, Prof. Anita, so that I can get feedback also from you, Prof. Anita. Thank you, Prof. Anita and Bu Susana.